Welcome to another edition of the Sports Lunatics. Who are the Sports Lunatics? We're just two regular guys who love sports history. I'm Shawn Lavigne in Halifax, Nova Scotia.
And I'm Howie Mooney here in Barrie, Ontario.
And you are listening to the Sports Lunatics. We have a website now, Howie, thesportslunatics.com, and also a YouTube channel, Sports Lunatics. Please, if you're watching us on YouTube, give us a like and subscribe to the channel.
And if you want to listen to us, I was going to say, if you want to listen to us, just the audio show, you can listen to that on Spotify.
See, we are multi-platform.
We are.
That's how good it's getting for the Sports Lunatics. Howie, we recently, there was a big birthday celebration in the world of hockey, and it sort of spurred this topic today. We have never done a countdown of the top NHL coaches of all time. I'm of course speaking of Scotty Bowman, and who turned 90, if you can believe it, this past week. So happy birthday to Scotty Bowman. And it spurred our top 5 list for today. Hopefully we can get through this in our time allotted, but I thought it would be appropriate that we go down this road. So we'll get right into it, Howie. And who is number 5 on your list?
Well, it's so hard to narrow it down to just 5. And I mean, some of the choices that I've made, and now I think when we talked about this originally, it was going to be coaches that we have seen or that were during our lifetimes, right?
You can make it whatever you want.
Okay. Merlin the Magician. No, I don't know him, but it's really, really hard. I think we know who number 1 is. But I've got at number 5, I've got Ken Hitchcock. Ken Hitchcock was an old school coach, no nonsense coach. Didn't really like to play his rookies as much as he liked his veterans. Was a guy that stressed fundamentals. A guy that was tough on players. Not unfair, but he was tough. Ken Hitchcock is my number 5.
Well, Ken Hitchcock's number 5 on my list. And if we have identical lists, then, we have identical lists. What can I say? The one thing with Hitch, there are some coaches that teams will make a coaching change, and that new coach immediately makes an impact. But that coach may only have a short shelf life because of their coaching style. And as you said, there's guys that come in and they're ass kickers, and that's what they do. But that routine wears out. Ken Hitchcock was sort of like that at some of his stops, especially later in his coaching career. His 4th on the NHL all-time wins list, 849 regular season wins, 86 playoff victories. Of course, as you said, winning the Stanley Cup as head coach of the Dallas Stars in 1999, who had a bunch of veterans and were on that cusp of winning a Stanley Cup or multiple Stanley Cup championships. But of course, that was also part of the Red Wing dynasty sort of years where they had those unbelievable hockey teams in the mid to late 90s and early 2000s. So I love the choice of Ken Hitchcock. He's number 5 on my list. Who's number 4?
Who's your number 4?
Well, my number 4, I'm going with a guy that I think has done so much with less, and that's Barry Trotz.
I
think Barry Trotz is one of those, he again was a head coach of an expansion team or a newer team in the National Hockey League with Nashville, had a long tenure from 1998 to 2014. But you have to say the talent on those Predator teams, especially in the early years, were not that great. But he got the most out of those players and was able to get them to the playoffs. Now, it took them a while to get past the first round of the playoffs. But, you know, Barry Trotz was always considered a great, great head coach, and coached, of course, the Washington Capitals in 2015 and won a Stanley Cup in 2018. And then, of course, finished off as head coach with the New York Islanders, but is now the general manager of the Predators. So Barry Trotz is number 4 on my list.
My number 4 is a guy that did a bit of traveling around, started his NHL career coaching in Quebec, but he won a Stanley Cup in 1993 with the Montreal Canadiens, Jacques Demers.
Wow.
Jacques Demers was a guy that his players loved him. He was the kind of guy that players would run through walls for him. And he did it as a guy who he couldn't read. There was a long period of time where he had to teach himself how to read, and it was later in life as an adult. And I think his story is one of those fascinating stories. And for him to be able to have done what he did with the talents that he had, it was a thrill for me to be in the Forum in 1993 when they won the Stanley Cup, and to see Patrick Roy raise the cup over his head, this cup right back here, over his head, and say, "I'm going to Disney's World." And Jacques Demers is my 4th pick.
That's a great one. I had the pleasure. Jacques was one of our analysts on, I think it was XM Radio, or no, the team way back when. There's been so many stops. But Jacques was awesome. It had great insight, was very entertaining on the radio. Of course, had a long career as a color analyst or with I believe RDS and on Montreal broadcasts over the years. But wonderful guy, and he was a hell of a coach, coaching in St. Louis and Montreal. And that 93 Stanley Cup, I still can't believe that they won it that year, because it felt like, you know, they were a good team, but they weren't, I would not say a favorite. It seemed like in every playoff series they had, they were the underdog.
Well, the things too is that the previous series, every time they played a series, the favorite coming out of the other series lost.
Right.
Pittsburgh was the defending Stanley Cup champions. They lost to the Islanders, and Montreal beat them in the second round. Every team that they played against was the team that was the underdog in the previous series and won. And so, yes, they were fortunate, but a cup's a cup.
Oh, no. I'm not saying they didn't deserve to win the Stanley Cup, because I remember I was in a bar in Chicago watching Game 7 of that Toronto-LA series, and everybody wanted Toronto to win to set up, a Toronto-Montreal Stanley Cup final.
It would have been a table hockey Stanley Cup, because when we were kids, all the teams that we got were always Montreal and Toronto.
That's right, but it would have been, it would have been huge. Like, it would have been, we still talk about it 30 years later. If you can believe it, it was 30 years ago.
Yeah.
That Montreal has won, and we haven't had a Canadian Stanley Cup champion since. We've been close, but they've never been able to bring it home. But that's a great one. That came out of right field. I'm not going to lie to you. No, that's great. Who's next on your list?
Next one on my list is a former police officer turned coach of the Hull Olympics, and went on to coach in Montreal, Toronto, Boston, and New Jersey. Sadly, he passed away way too young. Pat Burns is my number 3.
That's a great one. And it's funny, I was just thinking, I was going through the list of coaches, and he's easily in my top 10, but I didn't put him in my top 5. But I will say this about Pat Burns. Biggest travesty to me in Hall of Fame history.
I knew what you were talking about immediately as soon as you said travesty.
They had an opportunity to put him in while he was alive. Everybody knew he was sick.
Yeah.
they could have put him in, and unfortunately they didn't. They eventually did, but it was, he had deceased by then. To me, it's the biggest travesty that they've ever done. It still upsets me to this day, because I remember, that was always a big topic, especially working in Toronto, that they put Pat in for his accomplishments. And I don't even remember the class that they put in the year that they should have, but it was ridiculous that they didn't list him as one of the members that year. But that's a great choice. Pat Burns, fiery coach.
Yeah.
But
you talk about guys with shelf life. Pat Burns was one of those guys that had a shelf life, and once it had expired, he had to move on. But he had success everywhere he went. He was one of those guys like Hitch, where he would turn things around pretty much right away, and keep things at a high level for a while too.
Absolutely, and he can be fiery, but the players love playing for Pat.
Yeah,
absolutely. They would go through a wall to play for Pat Burns.
Yeah,
so that's a great choice. I'm going to number 3 with Al Arbour. The Islander dynasty never gets the credit it deserves for whatever reason. I don't know why they don't get the recognition. And I know the more years that pass, the fact that team or those teams tend to get forgotten in the conversation. And especially when you had the Oilers right after them doing their dynasty. But Al Arbour won a Stanley Cup 4 times. He had coached the Blues and the Islanders.
Yes.
He's 7th in NHL history with 782 regular season wins, but 123 playoff wins.
Yeah.
Great coach. Denny Potvin, who again, another analyst we used to have on XM radio, he would talk about how Al was always hard on him because he knew if he was hard on him, the rest of the team would listen and follow. If Al Arbour can yell at Dennis Potvin, for poor play or a poor practice, then that sends a message throughout the team, and it worked. And he won the Jack Adams as Coach of the Year in 1979. Ironically, the year before that they won their first Stanley Cup. So, and he was inducted in the Hockey Hall of Fame in 1996. So number 3 on my list, Al Arbour.
Well, Al Arbour is my number 2. And he, as you said, engineered a great team. And it's funny that you say that you perceive that they aren't as recognized as they should be. But I think, like, for me, I'm coming to see how great they were over the last couple of years, I think, especially with people on that team, that dynasty team from 80 to 83 passing on now. The work that Arbour did, not only as a coach, but as kind of an engineer of that team. The 1977 draft, and I joke about this, but the Islanders had one name on their draft list. They didn't really have just one name, but they had Mike Bossy on their list. Mike Bossy had been a 70-goal man every year in junior, yet he fell spot by spot by spot everywhere down the list. He was picked 15th overall. The Islanders couldn't believe that he fell to them. He was the guy that Bill Torrey wanted. And when Torrey asked Arbour, we got this guy that we like. He's a pure sniper, but he doesn't play that much defense. What do you think? He says, if he can score, get him. I'll teach him how to play defense. And Arbour had such confidence in his own abilities as a coach and as a mentor to be able to pick Mike Bossy. And the fact that he fell to 15 in 1977 was unbelievable to me. But he did, and he was the missing piece on that Islanders team because they didn't have that pure goal scorer. And Mike Bossy was not only a generational goal scorer, but he might have been one of the best pure goal scorers in NHL history. The Leafs had a chance to pick him with 2 of their picks. They took John Anderson, and then they took Trevor Johansson, the defenseman, because Harold Ballard was too afraid that Bossy's price tag would be so high that he would bolt for the WHA at the time. Imagine if Bossy had played on that Leaf team with Sittler, with McDonald, and with the guys they had coming up, with Vive and Derlago and all those guys. Anyway,
well, it's funny you say that though, because talking to a lot of players from that era of Leaf teams, they said they were missing one piece.
Interesting.
They always said they were missing one piece.
Yeah.
Now, they never said what that piece was, but they always felt that they were that close to being an elite hockey team. You just listed the names of the talent that they had,
mm-hmm.
and you throw Mike Bossy on that team, and that was the great thing with Sittler and McDonald. They weren't selfish players. Like, I could only imagine what could have happened. And now you're making many Leaf fans cry around the world.
Apparently, I tend to do that. Apparently, I tend to do that sometimes. You just
told Leaf fans that, it's bad enough they lost out on Gretzky, but then they could have had Bossy in the 70s. Come on now.
Well, I told you this story before too, like in the 2021 playoffs when the Habs dumped that vaunted Toronto Maple Leaf team that finished number one, way above everybody else in the Canadian division.
Yes.
And the morning after Montreal won Game 7, I took 2 steps into work, and the first thing I heard was "F you, Mooney."
I tell you, the love between Habs and Leaf fans is incredible.
Yeah, and as a Habs fan in Toronto, I'm a tiny red speck in a deep blue sea.
That's right. Wow, that's a great choice though. Al Arbour, like I said, I don't think gets, as the years go by, I don't think he gets the amount of credit that he deserves as being one of the greatest head coaches of all time.
Well, that Islanders team, they could beat you any way you wanted to play. If you wanted to play a run and gun game, they could play run and gun with you. If you wanted to play a physical game, they could out physical you. They could do anything you could do, and they could do it better.
Yeah, absolutely. And he was a good player too in his day. When he multiple Stanley Cups.
You and I are both wearing glasses. Al Arbour was the last NHL player to wear glasses while playing.
And there's your stat of the day.
Oh, one other thing about Al Arbour. In the 75 run that the Islanders went on, when they went from being terrible to being very good pretty fast, they won their first 2 series in crazy upsets. They beat the Rangers, and then they beat, who did they beat to get to? They played Philadelphia in the 3rd round. Oh, they beat Pittsburgh. They were down 0-3 against Pittsburgh and came back to win that series. Then they went 0-3 to Philadelphia, and they came back to tie the series. And while they were down, I think it was 0-2 or 0-3, Arbour had been having back spasms and having to spend his nights in traction in a hospital. And he went to his team and had a team meeting, and the players all thought he was going to ream them out for being down 0-3 and for not playing the way they did against Pittsburgh or the way they did against the Rangers. And he said to them, "Guys, I apologize to you. I have not been able to coach you the way I want to coach you." And Chico Resch said, when he said that, we were all ready to friggin' run through brick walls for him. When he apologized to us, when we were playing crappy, it rallied us and made us want to play for him. And they came back and tied that series up. And that was in Game 7. Kate Smith came out and sang "God Bless America" in the Spectrum. Ed Westfall skated over with a giant bouquet of flowers for her, and to nullify her effect on the outcome of the game. But Philadelphia still won.
That's a great story. I didn't know about the Westfall part.
Oh yeah. Yeah, that's and all funny. The whole team, Islanders team, came around and shook hands with her and said thanks for coming and all this stuff, and they tried to nullify Kate Smith's effect, but nonetheless, they still won. Philadelphia still won.
That's wild. Number 2 on my list, Howie, I'm going with Joel Quenneville. In light of some of the off the ice stuff that happened, and we can't deny what happened. Behind the bench, winning 3 Stanley Cups with the Chicago Blackhawks in an era where it's very difficult to keep teams together. And that is what I always find fascinating. I don't even know what a dynasty is anymore, but when you win 3 Stanley Cups in 5 years, I think it was, that Chicago had won. He's second all time in regular season victories.
Yeah.
He's got 121 playoff wins. We had just talked about the success that Arber had in the playoffs. Quenneville has done, just as much with Chicago and St. Louis and those teams. He coached Colorado, coaching Florida, but 2010, 13, 15 Stanley Cup champions with Chicago. And again, in that era where your team's different every year. Yes, you have your core, but you have all the pieces that you got to coach around that core. And he's one of the best to ever do it. And I have Joel Quenneville as my number 2.
I'm glad you included him. I didn't include him because I figured you would. Not that I have anything against your choice, but I think Joel Quenneville is a great coach. And I thought, there's no doubt that he belongs in a top 10. I didn't have him in my top 5 though. But everything that you said, the ability to keep winning in a salary cap era is a very, very difficult thing. And especially the way the flat cap, is now, for teams to still be consistently good, it's an amazing, a pretty amazing accomplishment. And what he did, you're right, despite having a top flight goalie, and I'm nothing against, the goalies they had, but his message and his system were all top notch. Absolutely.
Well, that's the thing. I in terms of the goaltenders, I would never have considered them elite goaltenders.
No.
Some of these other coaches did have elite goaltenders at one time or another, which was part of their success. Quenneville winning 3 Stanley Cups, I would never say had an elite goaltender. There will be people out there that will argue with both of us.
Of course.
But, players love to play for him. He always got the most out of his teams. One coach of the year in 2000 was St. Louis. St. Louis was a little disappointing because there were a lot of people that felt they had, the players that could win a Stanley Cup championship, and they fell a little short.
A few different years, yeah. A few different years.
Absolutely. But Joel Quenneville, number 2 on my list. I know number 1's going to be a shocker to everybody, Howie.
Did he ever just have a birthday, I think?
Yes. I believe he just turned 90. Scotty Bowman, number 1 in history with 1,244 regular season wins and 223 playoff victories. A remarkable career. Is still, even though he's technically not in hockey, he still goes to hockey games all the time. There was a great article by Dave Stubbs on NHL.com just about he's a hockey lifer, and that's what he loves to do. He goes to rinks, scouts kids, and that's what he's done now. And a lot of people forget, even though when his coaching career was over, he was part of the Chicago organization on there. We just talked about Joel Quenneville, but his son, of course, was the general manager. And, Scotty was a big part of that group, that power structure in Chicago in management. And people listen, like his input is always valued. And, the man has, one of the greatest sports careers in coaching that you'll ever see.
When Scotty Bowman was in St. Louis, coaching that team to 3 consecutive Stanley Cup finals, not winning any, but still getting there, he was coach and general manager of the Blues. There was a period of time where he felt that both jobs were a little bit too much. And who he tabbed to be his replacement on the bench in St. Louis for the times that he didn't want to coach was Al Arber. He had him as a defenseman on that team, on the St. Louis team. And Al was getting up in age. That's where Al Arber got his first coaching taste. Scotty Bowman would go back and forth between upstairs and downstairs. And when he was upstairs, Al Arber would be his coach. When he went to Montreal, he had a history with Sam Pollock. Bowman had coached the junior team in Ottawa Hull, the Canadians, to a Memorial Cup. And so he had a history in Montreal. After St. Louis, he went to Montreal and became the coach there. And we all know what Montreal did in the 70s. And then he went to Buffalo. And he was coach and general manager in Buffalo. And when he didn't, there were certain aspects of the general manager's job he didn't like working out contracts with players, especially when he had to coach them. So he handed that part off to his assistant general manager, Jerry Meehan. And Meehan, climbed the ladder of executiveness in hockey as well. Then he went to Pittsburgh and he was director of player development. Bob Johnson was the coach, and Bob Johnson succumbed to cancer. And Scotty went behind the bench in Pittsburgh and won a Stanley Cup there. It just success after success after success after success. And there were times when players hated him. In Montreal, he played mind games with players. But when they were looking at their Stanley Cup rings on their fingers, they all had to agree that Scotty Bowman brought out the best in them. And he was a guy. He was an innovator as well. That change where a guy gets off in the defenseman's door and a player jumps on at the other door, and gets like a 40-foot head start. Scotty Bowman was one of the guys that one of the guys that innovated and brought that in. I can't remember if he was one of the first guys to employ pulling the goalie with a minute left in the game, but something tells me that he was. He was always thinking about what can we do to help our team win this game or any game. And he was one of those guys that was always thinking, trying to figure things out.
Well, a couple of stories that I heard, Steve Shutt told a couple of great stories about, how the team did not like Scotty at all. And quite honestly, they hated him. But then they would get their Stanley Cup check in June or whenever they got it, because they won so many of them. And they put up with Scotty. But the other story was, I guess they were on for the Montreal Canadiens of the 70s, I guess they were struggling to put the puck in the net. So after practice, they come in the dressing room and Scotty had a net. And he grabbed a puck and he said, "Do you see the size of this puck? Do you see the size of this net?" And he throws I guess he either shoots or throws the puck in the net. "It's really not that epic." and anyways, they pumped 7 goals that night. Yeah. And it was just, he said he just always knew what buttons to press with that team. And and it is, it's funny. Remember in baseball, if I can give a baseball, Cito Gaston. Toronto would have so many great teams with the Blue Jays, but they would always fall short. And, when Cito was brought in, he got the most out of his veterans and was able, to manage veterans. Scotty was sort of like that too at the end, where he came in and look, there were a lot of big personalities. There were a lot of really great players, but he was able to mesh it because they were falling short. Not that he resurrected Steve Yzerman's career, but he sort of told Steve Yzerman, "You've got to change your game if you want to win."
Well, how many times did Steve Yzerman get cut from Team Canada, right, by Mike Keenan, until Scotty Bowman came in and told him, "You've got to prioritize a two-way game."
Absolutely. And, and the proof happened with Detroit going on that dynasty run.
Yeah.
Which was great. And, it was great. I still have that visual of him skating around with the Stanley Cup for his last one, which is always a great memory. And he just looked like a kid again. Like, it was wild.
But he's a guy who, as a coach or an executive, won 14 Stanley Cups. 14 Stanley Cups is, the only guy that had more was Jean Beliveau as a player, coach, or executive, and he had 17. But it's 14 Stanley Cups.
And ironically, the place where he never won in Buffalo,
Yeah.
that's where he lives.
Yeah.
He lives in the Buffalo area. So
Yeah.
yeah, it's crazy. What a hockey life that he had for sure, and influenced so many players and people in the game. So Scotty Bowman is number one on our list as the NHL all-time coach. That's a good list. I like it.
Yeah.
You threw in a couple of curveballs. I like it too. We do have a couple of minutes here, Howie. Again, we have a brand new website, thesportslunatics.com. We also have a new YouTube channel, Sports Lunatics. So please like and share this video. Also, subscribe to our channel and leave comments below as well. Give us your top 5 all-time NHL head coaches. We'd love to see your list, and we'd be happy to comment. And you never know, you might get a mention on air.
We're
And
always happy
Howie,
to.
you've got a book coming out. Tell us about the book.
Well, I actually I went through it. I went through the whole thing last night. I read a whole book yesterday, but went through the whole thing. Finished up the final. I hope, touch wood, edit of the whole thing. It's a follow up to my first book, Crazy Days and Wild Nights. It's more Crazy Days and Wild Nights. It'll be coming out in October, in time for Christmas. So thank you for allowing me to mention that.
Well, it's also your show, so you can mention it 1,000 times if you wanted it to. But no, I'm really proud of you, pal. We talk about it all the time, and as soon as it is available, we will be spreading the word and telling you how you can get Howie's new book. But also go on Amazon right now, Crazy Days and Wild Nights, and you can get Howie's first book.
It's true.
Sure. It is true. What a great show. Loved it. And thanks again for tuning into the Sports Lunatics, whether you're in the audio version or you're watching us on YouTube. Have a great sports day.